am I?
You, my friend, are in a labyrinth of hammers, chainsaws, and loud screechy people.
How did I get here?
Well, there's only one way to find out, isn't there?
I'm glad we can see eye to eye on that. Everyone, meet Simon. It's safe to say that many of us are quite familiar with this young man and the things he will be going through, but we weren't always so knowledgeable. We've come to know this man and his journeys through many hours of fighting alongside him, carefully guiding him towards, for better or worse, the outcomes we choose for him, and feeling every moment of grief, terror, anger, and triumph that he experiences. Throughout these journeys, there are mountains of hints, connotations, and metaphors strewn about this nightmare world, all of which are relatively easy to find with just a handful of playthroughs. But it's a little all over the place, and is certainly a lot to take in initially. The flashbacks, times, and settings vary greatly. The meanings of many of the monsters, locations, and main characters become apparent very gradually, and even the endings may leave you sitting there connecting the dots for a while. Or two. So what I'll do today is try to make sense of some of the events and monsters in this world and how they relate to the real Simon writing about them, and hopefully we'll find out a little bit more about him along the way. I'll be focusing on only the main campaign and its 4 main endings for this video, as the police co-op campaigns are kind of what-if scenarios, and the 5th ending is most likely a joke ending, as the tone and some of the game files would suggest.
Why?
Simon Henriksson, whose name is inscribed on a weird package in the Unlockables room after completing ending 4, is first seen walking down on Main Street, relaxed and feeling not so good, when all of a sudden, he is approached by a vertically challenged stranger.
What happened?
The identity of this man is elusive, as he only makes a few other appearances mere seconds later. And why the driver of this Yaris feels compelled to do this? Equally mysterious. The next few clips we see are the last pieces of reality as it slowly transitions into a world of madness. One's immediate reaction to this incident may be to question the authenticity of the stranger's distress, as he is seen shortly after the crash kneeling over Simon with a blank, eerie expression, looking as if this were a successful premeditated attack on Simon. But on the other hand, the lack of a clear motive, even after exploring the whole game, may lead one to believe that this man was indeed in pain, and the driver of the car was a lone perpetrator completely unrelated to him. Maybe in a rush of adrenaline, the man was able to attend to Simon's more serious injuries. He could have been the one who called the emergency services too. Now, as for the driver of this car, sadly there are more questions for this individual than there are answers. The reasons for their actions could be a number of things. A desire to kill, driving under the influence, forgetting what the long pedal on the right does. They're all genuine possibilities, sadly. And to add to the confusion, the short clip that is seen when Simon is comatose shows the car driving away, which conflicts with the flashback that is played after the second nightmare sequence later on, which shows the car parked in by emergency services. Another thing worthy of note is the car looks spotless as it drives off in the early short clip, leading me to believe that the hit-and-run incident involved the unknown driver running away rather than driving away, and the short scene of the Yaris fleeing the crash site was probably one of the first things the real Simon wrote in his book. Perhaps the thought of the car being driven away immediately after was more impactful to him as he wrote about it. Speaking of which, the real Simon at this point has been paralyzed from the waist down for a while now, and has been enduring a long and painful process of adjusting to his new life. His mental problems prior to the accident have not been a big help either, so his doctor, having already exhausted options involving antidepressants, recommends Simon try cognitive therapy, which involves him having a book to write down any of the terrible feelings he has whenever he needs to. Simon goes on to do even more than that. He decides to write an entire story dedicated to the events he'd been through before and after the accident, and this is the book's starting point. The events that unfold following the crash involves an uneasy amount of darkness and crosses to snap photos of with a camera you were given. At first, one might think Simon is in a coma and is hallucinating while recovering from the horrifying crash, but as we know, right at this moment, We have transferred consciousness from the real Simon into Book Simon's mind, hence the ability to walk around and see unusually horrible things. The dark area here could very well be a metaphor for the accident, or the Black Day, as Simon calls it. He would leave his room to go for a walk at night, having terrible thoughts to himself in his depressed state all the while, represented by all of the encouraging words found on the walls, and the brief flashes of various seemingly hostile characters that could be manifestations of feelings he has towards others, or himself. Towards the end of this area, distant screams are heard, which could be a reference to the distressed man on the ground. And just like the car crash, going towards the perceived distress leads to a disastrous and utterly terrifying shock. As quickly as that happened, Simon then wakes up in an alley appearing very confused and without a means to contact any of his ICE numbers. Feeling obviously nervous about his location, he draws his switchblade and presses on into the mysterious town, where many obscene horrors await him. The most interesting point to note about this first chapter is the apartment Simon has to fight his way through. The flashback played after completing this chapter shows real Simon's room on floor 3, only far cleaner and more inviting than what Book Simon had seen. Everything about this complex speaks 1,000 words about what the real Simon is probably writing about. It's known from the text that Book Simon receives from his mother, the look of his room at the beginning and end of the game, and his desire to get there, that this is where Simon used to live, with his mother. But the real Simon appears to live in an apartment by himself. Perhaps he moved there for various reasons after leaving the hospital? Perhaps at home with mother was becoming too much for him, or he or his mother looked for someplace more accommodating for him now that he's a paraplegic. Easier access and closer to a hospital and his doctor, which we'll get to in a minute. It could be that this entire onslaught through the apartments is a metaphor for the struggles that Simon faced having to live here. In one of the endings, Simon reveals that he
wish I could have taken everybody with me.
Further suggesting that living where he has not been a positive experience. The elevator is a hassle, the layout is a hassle, the annoying children, their parents, the handymen who work there, the one creepy guy he sees every now and again, are all a pain to deal with and would drain him every time he encounters them. Simon, feeling bitter and isolated in his flat among many close and obnoxious neighbors, would not write very sparing things about them, and would depict them as monsters who need culling so that peace may finally be a reality. After dealing with almost every resident in the building, Simon then descends a far more anomalous-looking set of stairs down to a basement, where he'll be fighting the Sora monster, who visibly expresses and even performs many self-loathing things, symbolic of the real Simon's struggles at the time. Winning the fight here would mean a huge victory for Simon back at home. He would have found a way to cope with those thoughts of harming himself, as difficult and taxing as it must have been. And now, Dr. Purnell.
Who's that?
Relax. I am not one of them.
This moment between these two is very interesting. The real Simon might have written about this to describe how he felt the first time he met him. Purnell would have appeared ominous, confusing, and certainly not trustworthy, especially straight away, hence the full-face gas mask. Simon would have been wondering what on earth Purnell is capable of. But hey, him not being one of those things and leaving the room without a fight is a nice change of pace, especially after all the hell Simon's been through.
What the?
Maybe this doctor's not so bad. Beyond this room are, yet again, more heavily deformed monstrosities, some beginning to lose their humanoid appearance. It's fair to say that these things may be a depiction of how Simon views himself. A deformed, massive flesh with a lot of issues. He'd be thinking day and night about himself that way. But having Book Simon symbolically wipe them out, or strategically moving past them, is a surefire way for Simon to cope with these lingering thoughts. There's a lot of them up ahead, sure, but one by one, they're going down. The next area of significance is a magazine found in a short corridor. Most of it is unreadable, but there's an article about depression and its warning signs. Dialing the number at the bottom of the page directs you to an ominous voice whose only help they offer you is the next step in Book Simon's journey. A code to the door right in front of him. The real Simon might have included this in his book to represent his experiences with a similar hotline he once felt compelled to call. Perhaps he felt nervous the whole time, hinted at by the spooky voice. Maybe he felt unsatisfied with what little help they offered. Maybe he was expecting something more substantial than advice just for that moment. But, while not life-changing, the call was helpful, and Simon was able to progress through life as he knew it, into the unknown. After a while, the unknown for Book Simon quickly becomes known for its increasingly frequent amounts of flooded areas, the last one being the room that houses the Doctor, a victim of his who is quickly silenced before he can provide some context for us, and the big bad Mace, who just ate the ticket out of this room. Apart from being slow, ragged, covered in bandages and strutting with munted legs that constantly dislocate, Mace doesn't appear to be any more relevant to the real Simon's situation than any of the more common monsters. It's hard to say why he wrote about Mace. Maybe it's as simple as that. He's broken. As for the Doctor's actions here, this could be Simon's own thought train continuing on from the last encounter, more looming thoughts of the Doctor hurting him. For some people, all it takes is a few bad stories about psychiatrist visits to taint their perception of them and their visits. So perhaps that's what the real Simon was trying to get across at this moment in time, albeit a little bit dramatic. Towards the end of this chapter is yet another nightmare sequence, this time with long, twisted halls that have more encouraging quotes written all over them, and an interesting section where you are forced to run through a floor of hands as they grab at your legs and hurt you. The flashback that is played when you find the door shows Simon's crash site surrounded by a plethora of emergency personnel and their vehicles. The takeaway from this might be the intense pain Simon went through as they pried the car away from him and lifted him into the ambulance. Every touch he felt would have been excruciating. But it didn't last forever. Deeper into the abyss we go. After fighting past many familiar faces, we come across another familiar sight. A chained-up door with yellow tape. But this time, it opens. And by opens, I mean open like a Kinder Egg with a firecracker surprise inside, and behind this door lies the realest depiction of pure anxiety. It's strong, it's fast, and it sneaks up on you. All you can do is run from it and hope it doesn't overwhelm you. Whether or not the real Simon wrote about this beast to represent specific moments in his life, or his anxieties as a whole, is irrelevant, as it drives its main point home either way. Poor Simon's had a few nervous breakdowns recently. In stark contrast to this ordeal, later on we receive a call from a nice young lady who politely asks us to meet her on the roof, albeit in a manner that would make Optus sound like kings. Naturally, Book Simon decides to gravitate towards this sweet-sounding voice, as it is the first one he's heard since he wound up here. And eventually, he learns that this voice belongs to a dear friend of his, Sophie.
Sophie? What the hell are you doing here?
Oh, hi, Simon.
What?
Right from the get-go, she seems totally oblivious to all of the monstrosities that have threatened Simon's life, making him feel as if they were illegitimate things, all in his head. Sophie might have been just like this in real life, too. Simon would try to explain all of his depressive and anxious thoughts to her, but ultimately, even though she gave him her sympathies and tries to listen,
I see. Some stuff.
She doesn't quite understand. Which is fair enough in her position. How could she possibly know what it feels like to be Simon without actually being in his position? As the conversation continues, Simon decides this would be an appropriate time to admit his feelings for Sophie. Surviving everything up to this point has been hard, but it seemed to strengthen him. He's toughened up enough to actually tell her the truth. But, sadly, Sophie rejects him.
I always thought that you were just a friend, nothing more. I'm sorry.
And Simon is visibly upset by this. As the awkward silence passes, Sophie does something that defies comprehension.
What do you mean?
You know full well what I mean.
Wait a sec, you mean all... No! 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 Sophie! Why did she... This isn't making any sense!
This thing named Carcass is as haunting as it is metaphorical, and is one of the two important turning points of this game.
You made her do it. Why? Why? You sick fuck!
You can stay and fight this disgusting thing, or you can flee and leave it there to fester. Whatever Simon does, he eventually ends up next to Sophie, and as he picks up the card she once held, a flashback plays, which sheds some light on what on earth just happened.
I love you, Sophie.
I have to leave. Please.
I fucking love
Just
you.
let me go, Simon.
The real Simon, prior to the events of the Black Day, confessed his love to Sophie, only in a far more desperate manner, and she rejects him, only far blunter than what Book Simon got to see. She kept saying she had to leave for somewhere. It must have been significant enough to garner such a passionate confession from Simon. Sophie jumping from the roof could be a depiction of the pain he felt when she rejected him and left. It would have been equal to her passing away. And Carcass could possibly represent Simon's sorrow and the worst traits about himself. Book Simon's initial reaction to Carcass could theoretically be him blaming himself for the loss, that somehow it was his ugly side that drove her to leave him. Choosing to flee from Carcass could be Simon's denial and bitterness towards facing his pain head-on, while choosing to stay and fight, the hard way, could mean him eradicating those thoughts about himself and dealing with the loss properly, perhaps even learning from this experience and readjusting himself in the process. But no matter the choice, the fact is that Sophie is gone now, and Simon must venture forth, alone. One thing that'd be no fun without Sophie anymore is school, which is what all the funny people outside of Australia call college. Part of their last conversation together revealed that these two met and kindled their friendship in this very place. Simon helped her through her rough times, and she helped him. He would have felt a little more important with such a lovely friend to look out for. And with that gone, is it any wonder the place looks so dark, and the people there so hostile? Someone with Simon's persona would easily be made fun of, especially during his weakest moments, and college in and of itself is a stressful place, so no wonder Simon created such a daunting place in his book. After a long series of events, Book Simon is left without a light source, and must traverse the darkness while only able to see about 1.5 meters in front of him, where the citalopram monsters reside. Citalopram is the name of a common antidepressant, which has both good and bad properties about it. It works well for many disorders in correct dosages and acts like a source of light in the darkness. But depending on the individual, or if taken in larger amounts, it can lead to many problems such as fatigue, impaired vision, dizziness, and in less common cases, aggression, anxiety, panic attacks, and can actually make thoughts of ending one's own life worse. In Simon's state, it could be possible that he has the urge to take more than he is supposed to, because it's only helping so much in the extremely dark place he's in right now. But he decided to do the stressful thing and defeat those urges, as the other option would likely have resulted in a less than favorable outcome. Up ahead, the darkness is fading. Finally! I'm sure the doctor will be happy to hear about it.
I told you not to come closer, you stupid psycho. Look what you made me do to you. Oh well, you probably would have done it to yourself anyway.
The doctor at this point is giving Simon very mixed signals. That's the second person he's treated, and the third time he's locked himself away from us. But at the same time, he restores our light source and leaves plenty of ammunition for us to continue on. What is he getting at? A quick stroll back to the apartments reveals a couple of interesting things. Firstly, this guy. I think Simon's book isn't doing him much good at this point. And secondly, Simon's room is now open. A quick inspection reveals undisputable evidence that something atrocious has happened here, which metaphorically could be the writing of the book itself. After soaking in the serenity for a while, Book Simon descends the ladder in the floor and ends up in a hallway that seems to go on forever. The real Dr. Purnell can be heard monologuing in the distance, as if creating a recording of the real Simon's current state, where he reveals his concerns for the young man. We learn from this speech that Simon wishes to not speak of the events prior to the accident, or his school and home life, further solidifying the notion that this is why his apartment, school, and Sophie's encounter are all depicted so gruesomely. Simon also reveals to him that he's been seeing things, but couldn't go into detail about what they were. The doctor seems skeptical about these claims, as it might just be a ploy for Simon to get more meds. But Purnell prescribes more antidepressants anyway. Simon having hallucinations isn't exactly a far-fetched concept, as one of the endings is the result of a psychosis, so maybe he did need more. True or not, he said the extra medication helps. Who wouldn't want more help if you feel like this guy? Thanks for the extra ammo, Doc. Another day, another ordeal survived. Up next in Simon's journey is yet another taste of psychotic insanity. The real Simon is even here. Just look at him go! Conjuring up a storm. Man, his shoulders must hurt. The men in the cages is easy enough to explain, but why on earth these paths are so twisted and random is still beyond comprehension. Was Simon having a psychosis while writing this? Was he feeling the effects of the extra pills? Why, Simon? A few splintered shins and a heart rate consistent with most acrophobia victims later, and we end up in a padded cell. Many, actually. There's the same note in the middle of all of them, which might explain why the paths that book Simon just balanced over are the way they are. It is one of the only pages of Simon's book we ever get to see. Everything that Simon has written here is broken and quickly changes from topic to topic. While it does make sense, a lot of connecting the dots needs to happen first. Maybe the gaps in between the things he was writing about were just filled in by Book Simon's world. He cannot progress without a means to get there. The real Simon at this point is obviously becoming very unstable. His grip on his life is spiraling out of control and is becoming more difficult to navigate through. Nothing's really helping him anymore, only masking or distracting from the real problems. At the door of this maze is another flashback where the doctor reveals Simon had many problems well before the Black Day, something we've already explored. Book Simon, fed up and confused at this stage, fixes a signal malfunction and boards a train, finally leaving this end of town in hopes for a brighter future. Along the way, he asks many questions to himself, many of which we've already answered, and also has to deal with a few scooter kids who haven't got their tickets, and a train track that's run out of track. Through some stroke of luck and many arcane swear words, Simon manages to climb out safe and sound. Every item he had that wasn't his clothes, however, has been swallowed by the wreckage, way out of reach. The real Simon is probably trying to convey a moment in his life where he felt like he had almost nothing, or many moments. Well done.
Better than nothing, I guess.
The past has been difficult, but at least Simon was relatively well equipped to deal with his foes. Winding up here, being armed with nothing but a piece of the surrounding forest, sure does put things into perspective. Simon back at home is undoubtedly in a very bad place right now, even worse than before. Unprepared and outnumbered by horrifying creatures, he barely manages to get away with his life using what little he has to fight them. And eventually, he finds a cozy bunker to take shelter in temporarily that houses one of the loudest and most deformed monsters Simon's ever come across. I think in terms of physical appearance, this one says the most about the Black Day. Its legs and its cries ring true to what would have been a very painful night. Feeling desperate and worn out at this stage, Simon then finds the doctor, who is seen entering a nearby mental asylum. And of course, our boy follows. In here is arguably the most unsettling part of this whole experience, even more so than the forest we just took a leisurely cold-sweated stroll through. Every room in here would have at one point housed very disturbing and broken individuals, and now all of the doors are open and they're running wild. Another allegory for Simon's mental state, I'd say. His thoughts and feelings aren't so isolated and controllable anymore. The doctor, in comparison to everything Simon's had to deal with recently, seems almost like a beacon of hope at this point, with a hint of ulterior motives. He is seen standing behind a large gate in the hallway, offering to help Simon progress through this chamber of fun in exchange for a weapon. Through most of the game, it's been a one-sided deal with this man, especially during the moments where he left us items to continue on. So this is an interesting change of pace. He needs us to trust him and help him out in order for us to continue. This right here, as we know, is the second turning point of the game, and will ultimately help decide Simon's fate, both metaphorically and literally, and is a perfect allegory for the moment the doctor asked Simon to write the book that we're in now. The pills by itself won't make you feel better, Purnell says during the next flashback, so we have to do something scary and trust that he knows what he's doing. We can choose to set aside our prejudgments and fears about the doctor and trust that he has a way for Simon to get out of this never-ending mess. Or we can remain stubborn and anxious about the doctor and choose to stonewall him so that if anything bad does happen, it hurts less.
I don't think I can trust you. I won't give you the gun.
Either way, the doctor gives us the key for the gate, although his reactions to our choices differ greatly, seeming either very pleased we trust him or disappointed that we haven't changed a bit. Also, in both scenarios, he does this.
You crazy bastard!
The only thing that makes sense here is that, in real life, the book writing ends up doing a fair bit of damage to Simon, making him feel as if he's been stabbed in the back, or shot in the shoulder, should I say. Another thing to note is the amount of damage the doctor does to Simon. If you choose not to trust him, he shoots you with his revolver, which has a smaller bullet and does less damage to Simon, while if you trust him with the larger caliber Ruger pistol, the damage done is much higher. In real life, choosing to trust him meant it hurt more when the book started to take its toll on Simon, who would have been expecting to feel better because of it, while instead remaining skeptical of Purnell wouldn't get Simon's hopes up so high, and therefore he wouldn't have fallen as hard when he realized how messed up his life was when writing. Thankfully, in either scenario, the bullet didn't hit any major arteries, so to speak, and Simon is still able to press on, sorting out some very bad guys, finding a number on a two-piece tablet and calling up the neighbors across from the window. Wait, is that... Oh, hi, Simon. How poetic. The real Simon is here too. Hang in there, buddy. Now to find that pesky doctor. He's hurt Simon, so we must hurt him back.
You're so fucking dead!
The fight that breaks out between these two could mean two things, depending on your choice made earlier. If you did not trust Dr. Purnell with the P345, then what the real Simon is writing about could be him fantasizing about killing the real doctor, or maybe even doing it for real, as is mentioned during two different endings. If you did trust Dr. Purnell with the 45, then Simon could be writing about him defeating his own sinister version of Purnell, leaving the professional, real-life one alive, maybe as a way to get the preconceptions about him out of his head. It's hard to say whether or not that's completely true though, as the fights are almost identical, and they both end the same way too, with Simon taking a page from Kenny's book from The Walking Dead and... well... he's not getting up from that one. Whether it be the eradication of a person he knew, or a person he invented, what is done is done. He can now proceed downstairs to the back door, and upon opening, he comes across many unusually sweet things. The sound of early birds looking for worms, an absolutely beautiful sunrise, and a cute little boat to get to the other side of this peaceful lake. The real Simon at this point must be feeling very content with whatever he chose to do. Not having his doctor watch every move he makes or choosing to work with him rather than against him must have made him feel liberated. At least for now. Simon, enjoy this while it lasts, okay? Because no matter what you chose, this couldn't have possibly fixed everything. There is still one last struggle before Simon gets home. At least now he knows that there is hope. This surely wasn't all for nothing, right? He fought so hard to get where he is and has overcome so many barriers.
Finally home.
Let's see how this story ends.
I hope Mom's okay.
Simon, in any combination, chose to leave Carcass where it hovered, or refused to trust the doctor with the gun, he ends up here. The rules here are simple. We are still Book Simon, outraged at what the real Simon had put us through, and all we have to do is fight our way through what is to be the last few pages of his book. Find Simon and make him pay for what he's done. In a last-ditch effort, Sick Simon here will try to stop Book Simon from reaching him, but he eventually prevails. He then stumbles over to him, absolutely hammers him off his chair, and mercilessly chokes him, which ends up killing them both, as the real Simon back at home is overwhelmed by all of this madness in his head and shoots himself, ending the book at the same time. In the first ending, Simon spares Carcass's life and keeps the gun from Purnell's hands. The reel that plays afterwards says the following.
Dear Diary, this is it. I have ended my miserable life.
In short, the real Simon's last thing he ever got to write was a passionate and furious declaration of hatred and bitterness for everyone and everything around him. He developed very paranoid feelings about those closest to him in his isolation, suspecting that everyone who ever tried to help him was, in the end, a two-faced liar who really hated him all along. He never recovered from Sophie's rejection, and he did not trust what his doctor was trying to do for him. That ended with him despising them so much that he decided to kill both of them in an act of vengeance, justifying his actions with a "they deserved it" approach. Simon even announces in a chilling confession that if it weren't for his disabilities, he would have committed even worse atrocities. But ultimately, he settled with the two people he was in frequent contact with. He even goes on to attack whoever finds Simon's body, which shows just how dangerous and cynical he had become after shutting himself in and focusing too much on the bad times.
I hope my dead body will haunt you forever. Fuck you!
This ending is the most tragic, and arguably the most likely ending that would arise from such a horrific life. Up next is the second ending, where Simon trusts his doctor, but does not fight Carcass. This time, a much more sorrowful Simon is heard speaking about how, despite his best efforts, and from the professional help of Dr. Purnell, he still felt empty and powerless against his problems. He apologizes to Purnell in advance, thanking him for his determination and help, mentioning that the book helped put things into perspective, but ultimately coming to the conclusion that
not everyone can be saved.
Sophie's rejection had hit him hard, and just like before, he never recovered from it. Although he isn't so angry about it this time. Instead, he is obsessive. He wanted her so badly and couldn't accept the fact that she didn't want to be with him, but he also didn't wish to live in this world anymore. So he decided in an extremely selfish act to take her with him as his own special person to be with beyond life as he knew it, so that nobody else could have her.
Farewell, everyone.
The third ending, the final of the nightmarish endings, reveals that Simon fought and defeated Carcass, but did not trust Purnell in the asylum. Simon is shown again to be very upset.
And I want it out so bad.
He is extremely disappointed in Purnell's methods and angrily protests the book he was supposed to write, claiming it made his problems worse and only made him realize just how bad his life was. Feeling betrayed and disgusted that he ever paid to help him, Simon kills Purnell in an act of self-absorbed revenge, proudly laughing about it for a bit too.
And now he's dead. It's almost poetic.
Sophie is completely unharmed this time, however. It appears that Simon figured out how to move on after that fateful night, and even begs to whoever finds Simon's remains to not show her this mess, showing that he still genuinely cares about her and does not harbor any bad feelings about it, as she is the only one who ever truly helped him.
Farewell, everyone.
At this point, a pattern seems to be forming. Simon needs both the help from a practical professional and somebody with a more sentimental attachment to him. Without either one, Simon's fate is doomed. But let's say he did things the hard way. Let's suppose he found a way to move on after Sophie's rejection and possibly rekindled their friendship in the process. Let's suppose that no matter how uncertain he was, he decided to trust his doctor. Neither of these decisions would be without consequences and hardships, sure, but that pain would never truly last in the grand scheme of things. How would doing the right thing affect Simon's attitude? Immediately, we can see that the Browning he's holding is pointed away from him, which is a start. We can also see that we are controlling a much more genuine version of Simon too, which is a nice surprise, right up until we exit his room. The kind of mess up ahead is starting to become far too familiar. But unlike the other three fiascos, the real Simon is chasing down a very hostile Book Simon. We are finally experiencing the opposing side, and a short fight ensues between the two, where Simon, in one final act of resilience against his own intuitive and dark thoughts, is victorious.
I stopped myself from doing it. From committing suicide.
This didn't happen in the book, however. It happened in Simon's mind. He had a vivid psychotic episode that night, and instead of firing at who he thought was Book Simon, he actually fired at two police officers who were about to enter his apartment. It's unclear as to why they were there. Maybe somebody, i.e. Dr. Purnell, was beginning to have concerns about Simon and called them to intervene. That wouldn't be highly unlikely. Simon reveals that because doctors testified in court that he was hallucinating, he will not be going to prison. Instead, he will be admitted to a mental hospital for the rest of his life, where he will be receiving further treatment and guidance from Dr. Purnell. Simon, in this ending, still admits that his situation is dire, but seems to have a different approach compared to what we've seen. He's accepted what has happened, what is happening, and what may happen in the future, and is determined to get on with his life and make the most of it. He also says he is lucky to have Dr. Purnell, and appears to have become closer with Sophie, with her visiting him every now and again. When she is allowed to, that is. It's apparent to Simon, however, that Sophie has forever been damaged by what he's done, and he can see it, even if she doesn't admit it. But it doesn't appear that it's enough to stop her from visiting Simon, however, as she still cares about him greatly. Another interesting thing to note is how Simon reacts to Sophie finding a new friend. While he still misses the old days they had together, ultimately, he is very mature about it, and is happy for her and wishes them both the best. As for his book, he decided that the main character deserves a happy ending, and was allowed to write one. Exactly what happened to him in the book is something we may never know, so let's just hope Book Simon is doing well wherever he is. Hopefully he's admiring a pretty view somewhere. Simon finishes here by saying just how much this book has changed his life, mentioning prior about how, despite what he's done, the support of those around him will be enough for him to be alright eventually.
The end.
This conclusion would arguably be the toughest for Simon to have reached, and it would have taken a lot of work and determination to end up in such a strong state of mind. But it's also the best one, all things considered. He has become amazingly resilient. I think he'll be alright. So there you have it. Simon Henriksson, a young man struck by a car and having to live as a paraplegic, is instructed by his doctor to write a book containing all of the bad thoughts he had, creating some of the darkest themes and monsters for his character to fight through, all of which are metaphors for his state of mind and the things he had to deal with, and he either inevitably gives in to his life stresses, or he goes down the path that, while still tragic, leads to him coming to terms with his inner demons and his new life, and starts to see things from a new perspective, so that he may be happy. What will it be? But then again, I may have missed the mark here. These metaphorical characters may have a different meaning to what I think they are. I could be assuming too much and did way too much projecting. You know how many damn characters there are, man? I wrote 6,500 words about this amazing man's journey. I'm bound to have messed up somewhere. I hope to God all these characters are subjective and kind of take a page from Stanley Kubrick's book with a kind of, what do you think about them approach? Or I'm gonna look like an idiot in front of the geniuses who slaved away for years to bring us this game. As they say, pro captu lectoris habent suo fate libelli. I butchered that so hard.